In the hushed interior of the church, Marion Thompson stood before the casket, her grief a heavy cloak around her shoulders. The sudden loss of her husband Charles had left her world in shambles, but as she gazed at the mourners, her eyes fell upon an unexpected sight. A little black girl, no more than 7 years old. It wasn't the child's presence that made Marion's breath catch in her throat. It was the familiar glint of silver around the girl's neck. In that moment, Marion's grief twisted into something darker, more complex. But what was so special about this necklace that made Marion's heart skip a beat? And how could this simple piece of jewelry challenge everything she thought she knew about her marriage and turn her entire world upside down? Before we dive in, comment below where you're watching or listening from today. And if you enjoy this gripping story, don't forget to subscribe. The late evening sunlight filtered through the curtains of Marion and Charles Thompson's living room in Rosewood, casting long shadows across the floor. The air was thick with tension, the kind that had been building for months, maybe even years. Marion, a 38-year-old blonde woman, stood in the center of the room, her blue eyes brimming with tears of frustration. Across from her, Charles paced near the door, his body rigid with stress, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and irritation. "Why can't you just talk about this with me?" Marion pleaded, her voice cracking. "We've been married for 7 years, Charles, and every time I bring up having a family, you find a reason to put it off." Charles sighed deeply, rubbing his forehead as if trying to ease an unbearable headache. The lines around his eyes seemed to deepen as he spoke. "Marion, it's just not the right time. Things are complicated. Work is stressful and—" "That's your answer every time," Marion cut him off, her voice rising with anger and hurt. "It's always about your work and your stress. But what about what I need? I want a family, Charles. Do you even want that with me?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy and accusatory. Charles stopped pacing and looked at her, his eyes now filled with a mix of regret and exasperation. The silence stretched for a moment before he muttered, "You don't understand. I just can't deal with this right now." Before Marion could respond, Charles reached for his car keys on the side table. His movements were brusque and final, brooking no argument. Marion opened her mouth to speak, but the words died in her throat as Charles headed for the door. The slam echoed through the house, leaving Marion standing alone in the suddenly quiet room. She sank onto the couch, her body trembling with emotion. This wasn't the first time they had had this argument, but something about tonight felt different. The finality in Charles's actions, the look in his eyes, it all spoke of a distance growing between them that Marion wasn't sure how to bridge. As the minutes ticked by, Marion's anger slowly gave way to worry. She checked her phone repeatedly, willing it to ring, for Charles to call and apologize, to come home so they could talk things through. But the screen remained stubbornly dark. An hour passed, then two. Marion paced the living room, her earlier frustration now overshadowed by a gnawing sense of dread. She tried calling Charles again and again, but each call went straight to voicemail. His voice telling her to leave a message only intensified her anxiety. Just as she was considering calling the police, her phone rang. An unknown number flashed on the screen. Marion's heart leaped into her throat as she answered. "Mrs. Marion Thompson?" a calm official voice asked. "Yes, this is she," Marion replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Who is this?" "This is Officer Green from the County Police Department," the voice continued, and Marion felt her world tilt on its axis. "I'm afraid there has been an accident involving your husband, Charles Thompson." Marion's knees gave out, and she slumped onto the couch, her breath caught in her throat. "What? What do you mean? Is he okay?" There was a long, dreadful pause before Officer Green responded, his voice heavy with regret. "I'm very sorry, ma'am. He didn't survive the accident." The world seemed to spin around her, and Marion dropped the phone, her vision blurring. She barely registered the officer's voice still coming from the device on the floor, asking if she was all right, if there was someone who could be with her. In a haze, she grabbed her keys and rushed to her car. The drive to the hospital was a blur, the city lights melding together as she navigated the empty streets. Her hands trembled on the steering wheel, and more than once she had to remind herself to breathe. At the hospital, she was guided to a small, sterile room. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed incessantly, the sound drilling into her skull. A white sheet covered the body on the stretcher, and Marian felt her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. When the nurse gently pulled back the sheet, revealing Charles's still face, the reality of it all hit Marian like a physical blow. She collapsed to her knees beside the stretcher, a wail of anguish tearing from her throat. The weight of their final argument, the harsh words, the unresolved anger, crushed her. "I'm sorry," she sobbed, clutching Charles's cold hand. "I'm so sorry. Please, please come back." But Charles remained still and silent, and Marian's pleas echoed unanswered in the cold hospital room. The days that followed Charles's death passed in a hazy blur for Marian. She moved through her house like a ghost, each room a stark reminder of what she lost. The sofa where they used to cuddle during movie nights now seemed vast and empty. The kitchen table where they had shared countless dinners was a barren landscape that Marian couldn't bring herself to sit at alone. Friends and family came by, offering condolences and bringing food she couldn't stomach. Their words washed over her, failing to penetrate the fog of grief that enveloped her. She nodded mechanically at their well-meaning platitudes, all the while feeling as if she were watching the scene from outside her body. "He was such a good man," they'd say, or "time heals all wounds." Marian wanted to scream at them, to tell them they didn't understand. How could they when she herself couldn't make sense of the turmoil inside her? The last words between her and Charles replayed in her mind on an endless loop. The anger, the uncertainty, the accusation. She wished desperately that she could take it all back. If only she could have one more moment with him to make things right. But there was no more time, and the finality of it all felt like a crushing weight on her chest. Nights were the worst. Marian would lie awake in their bed, now just her bed, staring at the ceiling. The emptiness of the space beside her was a constant, aching reminder of her loss. Sometimes in the hazy space between waking and sleeping, she'd reach out, half expecting to feel Charles's warmth. The cold sheets that met her fingers would jolt her back to reality, and she'd curl into herself, muffling her sobs in the pillow. A few days before the funeral, Marian forced herself to go into Charles's study. She told herself it was to begin organizing his belongings, but deep down, she was searching for something, anything, that might bring her comfort. She opened drawers and rifled through papers, hoping to find a note, a sign that he had loved her despite everything. But as she searched, she found nothing but mundane work documents and old bills. No hidden love letters, no secret journal entries professing his undying love for her. The absence of such tokens only deepened Marian's pain, making her question every moment of their relationship. Had it all been a lie? Had Charles ever truly loved her? The doubts gnawed at her, mixing with her grief to create a toxic cocktail of emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. As the light faded outside, Marian found herself sitting on the floor of Charles's study, surrounded by the detritus of his life. Papers were strewn about, drawers left open, but she had found nothing to ease the ache in her heart. She leaned back against the desk, hugging her knees to her chest, and let the tears flow freely. She cried for the love she had lost, for the future they would never have, and for the words left unsaid between them. As the sobs racked her body, Marian felt as if she were purging years of pent-up emotion. Not just grief, but frustration, anger, and regret. When the tears finally subsided, Marian felt hollow, emptied out. She didn't have the energy to move, to clean up the mess she'd made, or even to make it back to her bedroom. Instead, she curled up on the floor of the study, using Charles's old sweater as a pillow. The faint scent of his cologne still clung to the fabric, and Marian breathed it in, clinging to this last tangible connection to her husband. As she drifted off into an exhausted sleep, Marian's last coherent thought was a plea to whatever higher power might be listening. "Please, just let me understand. Let me find peace." But peace, it seemed, was still a long way off. The day of Charles's funeral dawned gray and overcast, as if the very sky was mourning along with Marian. She stood in front of her bedroom mirror, barely recognizing the pale, drawn face that stared back at her. Her black dress hung loosely on her frame. She'd lost weight in the days since Charles's death, food tasting like ash in her mouth. As she fastened a simple necklace around her neck, a gift from Charles on their first anniversary, Marian felt a fresh wave of grief wash over her. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and steeled herself for the day ahead. The funeral home was filled with a somber crowd when Marian arrived. Colleagues of Charles, friends, and family members milled about, speaking in hushed tones. Marian nodded mechanically as people approached her, murmuring their condolences. Their words blurred together, a meaningless jumble of sympathy that did nothing to ease the ache in her heart. She stood beside the casket, her face a mask of composure that belied the turmoil within. Each person who approached, each hand that squeezed hers in sympathy, felt like an intrusion. Marian wanted to scream, to tell them all to leave her alone with her grief. But instead she nodded, forcing her lips into what she hoped resembled a grateful smile. As the service came to an end, Marian's gaze drifted across the room, not really focusing on anything. But then, something caught her eye. At the edge of the crowd stood a young black girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, holding the hand of a black woman. The girl's dark, curly hair framed a face that seemed oddly familiar, though Marian couldn't place why. It was then that Marian noticed the necklace. Around the girl's neck hung a silver locket, a circle metal shape that Marian instantly recognized. Her heart skipped a beat, and she stared, frozen in place. That locket. She knew every detail of it intimately. After all, she had spent weeks picking it out, had it specially engraved, and gave it to Charles on their 5th wedding anniversary. It was meant to hold a picture of them, a symbol of their love and commitment. So why was it around the neck of this child? Before Marian could move or say anything, the woman took the little girl's hand, leading her away. Marian watched, her mind reeling as they disappeared into the crowd. Questions flooded her mind, each one more distressing than the last. Who was that girl? Why did she have Charles's locket? And why did she look so familiar? The rest of the funeral passed in a blur. Marian went through the motions, accepting condolences and thanking people for coming, all while her mind raced with possibilities. Each scenario she imagined was worse than the last, and by the time she returned home, she felt as if she might shatter from the weight of her suspicions. That night, Marian was haunted by the image of the little girl and the locket. She tossed and turned in bed, unable to find rest. The questions multiplied in her mind, demanding answers she wasn't sure she was ready for. Finally, unable to bear it any longer, Marian got up. She padded down the hallway to Charles's study, flicking on the light. The room was still a mess from her earlier search, but now she had a purpose. She needed to find something, anything, that might explain what she had seen at the funeral. With trembling hands, she began to search more thoroughly than before. She pulled out every drawer, emptied every file folder, even checked behind picture frames for hidden compartments. Hours passed and still, she found nothing. Just as she was about to give up, her hand brushed against something in the back of Charles's desk drawer. It was the velvet box that had held the locket she'd given him. With a sense of dread, she opened it. Empty. Her heart sank. This confirmed that the locket she saw on the girl was indeed the one she had given Charles. But it explained nothing about why he had given it away. Determined now, Marian continued her search with renewed vigor. It was nearly dawn when she found it, a photograph tucked away in an old day planner. Her hands shook as she pulled it out. The picture showed Charles holding a black baby with dark, curly hair. His smile was radiant, full of a joy Marian had rarely seen. With a jolt, she recognized the child. It was a younger version of the girl she had seen at the funeral. Marian's legs gave out, and she sank to the floor, the photograph clutched in her hand. The implications were clear, but her mind refused to accept them. Charles, her Charles, had another child, a secret family. As the first rays of sunlight began to filter through the window, Marian sat amidst the chaos of the study, her world once again shattered. The grief she had been grappling with now mingled with a new, sharp pain of betrayal. She stared at the photo, tears blurring her vision. "Oh, Charles," she whispered, her voice breaking. "What else didn't I know about you?" The days that followed Marian's discovery were a whirlwind of emotion. She oscillated between numbing disbelief and searing anger, her grief now tainted by the bitter taste of betrayal. Sleep eluded her, and when she did manage to drift off, her dreams were plagued by images of Charles with his secret family. One morning after another restless night, Marion found herself sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the phone. She knew she needed answers, but the thought of confirming her suspicions terrified her. What if the truth was even worse than she imagined? Finally steeling herself, she picked up the phone and dialed the number of the funeral director. Her heart pounded in her chest as she waited for someone to answer. "Hello, Rosewood Funeral Home," a somber voice answered. Marion took a deep breath. "Yes, hello. This is Marion Thompson. I need some information about my husband's funeral." "Of course, Mrs. Thompson. How can I assist you?" Marion's voice trembled as she asked, "Was there a woman named Lydia Harper on the list of attendees?" There was a pause, the sound of papers rustling. "Let me check our records. Yes, I see a Lydia Harper listed here." Marion's grip on the phone tightened. "And did she bring a child with her?" Another pause. "Yes, it looks like she did. The child's name is listed as Amara Thompson." The room seemed to spin around Marion. Thompson. The child had Charles's last name. It wasn't just a coincidence or a misunderstanding. This was real. "Mrs. Thompson, are you still there?" Marion realized she had been silent for several moments. "Yes, I'm here. Thank you for the information." She hung up the phone, her hand shaking. The confirmation she had sought now felt like a physical weight on her chest. She needed someone to talk to, someone who could help her make sense of this mess. Without thinking, she dialed Claire's number. Claire had been her best friend since college, the one person Marion knew she could always count on. The phone rang twice before Claire's cheerful voice answered. "Marion, how are you holding up?" The concern in Claire's voice was enough to break the dam. Marion found herself pouring out everything. The girl at the funeral, the locket, the photograph, and now the confirmation from the funeral home. "Oh, Marion," Claire breathed when Marion finished. "I'm so sorry. God, I can't even imagine what you're going through." "I don't know what to do, Claire," Marion admitted, her voice small. "I thought I knew Charles. I thought we were happy. How could he do this?" "I'm coming over," Claire declared. "You shouldn't be alone right now." An hour later, Claire arrived, armed with a bottle of wine and a determined expression. She enveloped Marion in a tight hug as soon as the door opened, and Marion felt some of the tension leave her body at her friend's comforting presence. They settled on the couch, glasses of wine in hand. Claire listened intently as Marion recounted the events in more detail, her face a mixture of sympathy and barely concealed anger. "I just can't believe it," Marion said, staring into her wine glass. "All those years, Claire, all those times he said he wasn't ready for a family, and all along, he had a child with another woman." Claire reached out and squeezed Marion's hand. "Have you thought about what you want to do next? Do you want to try and find this Lydia person?" Marion shook her head, uncertainty clouding her features. "I don't know. Part of me wants answers, wants to confront her and demand an explanation. But another part, I'm scared, Claire. What if there's more? What if knowing the whole truth just makes everything worse?" Claire's expression hardened. "You deserve to know the truth, Marion. Charles may be gone, but you shouldn't have to live with this uncertainty. If it were me, I'd want to know everything." They spent the rest of the evening talking, Claire offering a steady stream of support and righteous indignation on Marion's behalf. By the time Claire left, Marion felt more grounded, though no less conflicted about what to do next. That night, as Marion lay in bed, she found herself remembering the little girl's face, Amara. The name echoed in her mind. Despite everything, she couldn't bring herself to hate the child. Amara was innocent in all of this, a victim of adult choices just as much as Marion herself was. With that thought, Marion made a decision. She would find Lydia Harper. She needed answers, needed to understand the extent of Charles's deception. Only then could she begin to move forward. The next morning, Marion and Claire sat at Marion's kitchen table, laptops open, determined to find any information they could about Lydia Harper. They started with social media, hoping to find a profile that might give them a lead. After an hour of searching, Claire let out a triumphant, "Aha!" She turned her laptop to face Marion. "I think I found her." Marion's heart raced as she looked at the screen. There, smiling faintly at the camera, was the woman she had seen at the funeral. She was holding hands with a young girl, Amara, and around the child's neck, clearly visible, was the locket. Marion felt tears welling up in her eyes as she confirmed that they were indeed the same people she had seen at the funeral. Claire sighed deeply, giving Marion's shoulder a gentle squeeze. "What do you want to do now?" Claire asked softly. Marion took a deep breath, steeling herself. "We need to find out where she lives. I need to talk to her. Face to face." Claire nodded, her expression a mixture of concern and determination. "Okay, but promise me, Marion, you won't do anything until we know for sure. And when you do go, I'm coming with you. You shouldn't have to face this alone." Marion agreed, grateful for her friend's unwavering support. As they continued their search, Marion felt a strange mix of emotions churning inside her. There was anger, yes, and hurt. But there was also a growing need to understand. Why had Charles kept this secret? Why had he chosen to stay with Marion while having another family on the side? As the day wore on and they gathered more information, Marion found herself thinking more and more about Amara. What was she like? Did she know about Marion? How much had Charles been a part of her life? These questions and countless others swirled in Marion's mind as they pieced together the fragments of Charles's secret life. With each new discovery, Marion felt as though she was losing her grip on the man she thought she had known. The Charles she had loved seemed to be slipping away, replaced by a stranger with a double life. Yet even as her anger and confusion grew, Marion couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story. Something about the sadness in Lydia's eyes in the photos they found, the way Charles had always seemed conflicted about having children with Marion, it all hinted at a complexity that Marion wasn't yet ready to face. As night fell and Claire prepared to leave, Marion found herself standing in front of the window, staring out at the darkening sky. Her reflection looked back at her, a woman she barely recognized anymore. "We'll figure this out," Claire said, coming to stand beside her. "Whatever the truth is, we'll face it together." Marion nodded, grateful for her friend's presence. But as she bid Claire good night and closed the door, she couldn't shake the feeling that her life was about to change irrevocably. For better or worse, the truth was coming, and Marion knew she had to be ready to face it. The next day dawned bright and clear, a stark contrast to the turmoil in Marion's heart. She and Claire had agreed to meet early, determined to find Lydia's address and confront her. As Marion waited for Claire to arrive, she found herself pacing the living room, alternating between steeling her resolve and fighting the urge to call the whole thing off. When Claire's car pulled up, Marion took a deep breath, grabbed her purse, and stepped out into the morning sun. Claire greeted her with a hug and a supportive smile. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Claire asked, concern evident in her voice. Marion nodded, her jaw set with determination. "I have to know, Claire. I can't move on until I understand." They set off, following the directions they had pieced together from their research. As they drove, the neighborhoods gradually changed. The well-maintained lawns and picturesque houses of Marion's area gave way to more modest dwellings, then to run-down apartment buildings and graffiti-covered walls. Marion felt a pang of guilt as she realized how different Lydia's life must be from her own. Had Charles been supporting them? If so, why were they living in such a deprived area? After nearly an hour of driving, they found themselves in a neighborhood that made Marion's heart sink. The buildings were dilapidated, windows boarded up, and trash littered the streets. This couldn't be right, could it? They parked the car and decided to continue on foot, hoping to find someone who might know Lydia. As they walked, Marion felt increasingly out of place in her neat blouse and tailored pants. The few people they passed eyed them suspiciously, clearly marking them as outsiders. After an hour of fruitless searching and asking around, they spotted an elderly woman sitting on a bench, knitting. Desperate for any lead, they approached her. "Excuse me," Marion said, her voice tentative. "We're looking for someone who might live around here. A woman named Lydia Harper?" The old woman looked up, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Lydia? She used to live across the street there." She pointed with her knitting needle to a rundown apartment building. "But she moved out a few weeks ago. Heard she wasn't doing too well." Marion's heart sank. They had come all this way, and Lydia was gone. "Do you know where she might have moved to?" The woman shook her head. "Sorry, dear. Folks come and go around here all the time. Nobody really keeps track." Thanking the woman, Marion and Claire walked back to the car in defeated silence. As they got in, Marion felt the weight of disappointment crushing her. They had been so close only to hit another dead end. As Claire started the car, Marion finally broke down. Tears streamed down her face as she let out all the pent-up frustration and grief. "I don't know what to do anymore, Claire," she sobbed. "But I can't let it end like this. I need answers. I need to understand why Charles did this, why he lied to me for so long." Claire reached over and squeezed Marion's hand. "We'll figure it out, Marion. This isn't over. We'll find another way to track her down." As they drove home, Marion stared out the window, her mind racing. The image of the decrepit neighborhood where Lydia had lived haunted her. How could Charles have let them live like that? It didn't fit with the man she thought she knew. That night, as Marion lay in bed, unable to sleep, she made a decision. She couldn't wait anymore. She needed to do something, anything, to feel like she was making progress in unraveling this mystery. With a sudden burst of energy, she got up and went to Charles's study. She would go through everything again, every scrap of paper, every file on his computer. There had to be something she had missed, some clue that would lead her to Lydia and Amara. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows, Marion was still there, surrounded by papers and old photographs, determined to find the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Days passed and Marion's obsession with uncovering the truth grew. She barely ate or slept, spending every waking moment combing through Charles's belongings, searching for any clue that might lead her to Lydia and Amara. The house, once immaculate, now looked like a disaster zone, with papers strewn about and drawers left open. Claire visited regularly, bringing food and trying to convince Marion to take a break, but Marion was relentless in her pursuit. The not knowing was eating her alive, and she felt that if she could just find one more piece of information, everything would make sense. One night, about a week after their failed attempt to find Lydia, Marion sat in Charles's study, surrounded by the detritus of her search. She held in her hands a stack of bank statements she had found hidden in the back of a filing cabinet. The statements showed regular payments to an account in Lydia's name, confirming that Charles had indeed been supporting them financially. As she stared at the numbers, something inside Marion snapped. The magnitude of Charles's deception hit her anew, and she felt a surge of rage unlike anything she had experienced before. With a cry of anguish, she swept her arm across the desk, sending papers flying. She stormed out of the study and through the house, suddenly unable to bear the sight of anything that reminded her of Charles. In the living room, she grabbed a framed photo of them on their wedding day and hurled it against the wall, watching with grim satisfaction as the glass shattered. "How could you?" she screamed at the smiling face of her dead husband. "How could you lie to me for so long? How could you pretend to love me while you had another family?" She continued her rampage through the house, upending furniture and smashing mementos of their life together. Each act of destruction felt cathartic, a physical outlet for the pain and betrayal that had been consuming her. Finally, exhausted and surrounded by the wreckage of her married life, Marion collapsed to the floor, her body racked with sobs. She cried for the life she thought she had, for the future that would never be, and for the innocent child caught in the middle of it all. As her sobs subsided, Marion felt a strange calm settle over her. She looked around at the destruction she had wrought and felt a twinge of shame. This wasn't who she was. This wasn't how she wanted to handle this situation. With shaky legs, she stood and made her way to the kitchen. She poured herself a glass of water and drank it slowly, trying to calm her racing thoughts. As she set the glass down, her eyes fell on the car key sitting on the counter. Without fully realizing what she was doing, Marion grabbed the keys and headed for the door. She needed to get out, needed to go somewhere, anywhere, that wasn't filled with memories of Charles and their life together. She got in the car and started driving, with no particular destination in mind. The streets were nearly empty at this late hour, and Marion found herself automatically taking familiar turns. It wasn't until she saw the gates of the cemetery looming ahead that she realized where her subconscious had led her. Marion parked the car and got out, her feet crunching on the gravel path as she made her way to Charles's grave. The moon cast long shadows across the tombstones, giving the cemetery an eerie, otherworldly feel. When she reached Charles's grave, Marion stood there for a long moment, staring at the cold stone that bore his name. Then slowly, she sank to her knees in front of it. "Why?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "Why did you do this to us? To me? To Amara? What were you thinking, Charles?" She waited as if expecting an answer from the silent stone. When none came, she continued, her voice growing stronger. "I loved you. I gave you everything I had. Was it not enough? Was I not enough? How could you build a life with me while having a child with another woman?" Marion's words echoed in the empty cemetery. Her pain and confusion laid bare under the indifferent stars. She poured out her heart, alternating between anger and sorrow, demanding answers she knew would never come. As she knelt there, lost in her outpouring of emotion, Marion didn't notice the figures approaching from the other side of the cemetery. It wasn't until she heard a small gasp that she looked up, her heart stopping as she recognized the two people standing a few yards away. Lydia Harper stood there, her face pale and drawn, holding the hand of a wide-eyed Amara. For a moment, the three of them stared at each other, the air thick with tension and unspoken words. Then, without a word, Lydia turned and quickly led Amara away, leaving Marion kneeling by the grave, her mind reeling from this unexpected encounter. As she watched them disappear into the darkness, Marion felt a new determination settle over her. She would find a way to talk to Lydia, to get the answers she needed, and somehow she would find a way to make peace with this new reality, for her own sake and for Amara's. Standing up, Marion placed a hand on Charles's tombstone, her touch a mix of farewell and lingering questions. Then, with a deep breath, she turned and walked back to her car, her mind already formulating a plan for what she needed to do next. The encounter at the cemetery had left Marion shaken, but more determined than ever to get answers. She spent the next few days gathering her thoughts and steeling herself for what she knew would be a difficult confrontation. Finally, a week after the cemetery incident, Marion found herself standing outside Lydia's apartment building. She had managed to track down the address through some persistent detective work and a bit of luck. The building was in a different part of town from where they had initially searched, but it was still in a neighborhood that had seen better days. Marion's heart pounded as she approached the front door. She had asked Claire to come with her for support, and her friend stood beside her, a comforting presence in this moment of uncertainty. Taking a deep breath, Marion raised her hand and knocked on the door. The sound seemed to echo in the quiet hallway, and for a moment there was no response. Just as Marion was about to knock again, she heard movement from inside the apartment. The door opened slowly, revealing Lydia. She looked even more frail than she had at the cemetery, her face pale and drawn. Her eyes widened in shock as she recognized Marion. Before Lydia could speak, Marion blurted out, "Who are you? Why were you at my husband's funeral? Why does your daughter have my husband's last name? And where did she get that necklace?" Lydia hesitated, her eyes darting from Marion to Claire. Before she could respond, a small figure appeared behind her. Amara peeked out from behind her mother's leg, her eyes wide with fear as she looked at the strangers at the door. The sight of Amara wearing the locket, her locket, around her neck caused Marion's anger to flare anew. "Why does your daughter have that necklace?" she demanded, her voice rising. "It was supposed to be for Charles. It was my gift to him." Amara, frightened by Marion's shouting, began to cry. She clung to Lydia, her small hands wrapped around her mother's waist. Lydia took a shaky breath, tears welling in her own eyes as she tried to calm her daughter. Claire, seeing the situation spiraling out of control, quickly stepped forward. She gently grabbed Marion's arm, trying to pull her back. "Marion," she said softly, "that's enough. Let's go." Marion resisted for a moment, tears brimming in her eyes. She felt the weight of betrayal crush her once again, the raw anger at the sight of the child, Charles' child, wearing her gift to him. But as she looked at Amara's frightened face, she felt a pang of guilt. This child was innocent in all of this. Finally, she allowed Claire to pull her away, stumbling back towards the car. Her body sagged in Claire's embrace as the adrenaline drained from her system, leaving her feeling hollow and exhausted. Once they were inside the car, Marion broke down, sobs racking her entire body. She buried her face in her hands, her voice barely a whisper. "Why, Claire? Why did he do this to me? Why did he have to ruin everything?" Claire's heart ached for her friend. She reached over, wrapping Marion in a hug. "I'm here, Marion," she whispered. "We're going to get through this." Marion nodded, her breathing still ragged. They sat in silence for a while, Claire rubbing soothing circles on Marion's back as she tried to compose herself. As the sobs subsided, Marion wiped her tears, a steely resolve starting to form in her eyes. "I have to try again," she said, her voice hoarse but determined. "I have to hear what she has to say." Claire looked into Marion's eyes, seeing her determination. Though she was worried, she knew she couldn't stop her friend. She sighed and nodded. "All right, but let's do it calmly. We don't want to scare the child again." Marion agreed, taking a few deep breaths to center herself. She knew she had let her emotions get the better of her, and she was ashamed of how she had acted in front of Amara. Whatever had happened between the adults, the little girl was blameless. They waited a few more minutes to ensure Marion was completely calm before stepping out of the car. As they approached the door once again, Marion's heart was heavy, but now determined to hear the truth, no matter how painful it might be. This time, when Marion knocked, it was with a gentler touch. The door opened, and Lydia stood there again, looking more fragile than before. Her eyes were red from crying, and Amara peeked out from behind her, her small face full of confusion and fear. "Please," Claire said gently, before Marion could speak. "We just want to talk." Lydia swallowed, then nodded. She opened the door wider, allowing Marion and Claire to step inside. The apartment was small and sparsely furnished, but tidy. It was clear that an effort had been made to keep things in order, despite the hardship. Lydia led them to a worn-out sofa, sitting down slowly as if her body ached. Amara stayed close, her eyes never leaving her mother. Marion sat across from them, her eyes still full of pain, but her voice was softer now. "Who are you?" Marion asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why was my husband constantly sending you money?" Marion's voice broke as the questions rolled out. She pulled out the photograph she had found, the one of Charles holding baby Amara. "Why is this picture in his study? Why does your daughter have my husband's last name? And why does she have that locket?" Lydia closed her eyes for a moment, as if gathering her strength. When she opened them, there was a deep sadness there, mixed with resignation. She looked sick, her skin pale, and her hands trembling slightly as she held Amara close. "I never wanted it to be like this," Lydia began, her voice shaky. "Charles and I, it was a mistake. We met the night of his bachelor party." Marion felt her heart constrict at these words, but she remained silent, letting Lydia continue. "I didn't know he was getting married. We were both drunk, and, well, it just happened. I never expected to see him again, but then I found out I was pregnant." Lydia paused, running a hand through Amara's curls. The little girl leaned into her mother's touch, still watching Marion and Claire warily. "I found Charles months later to tell him about the baby. He was devastated. He begged me to keep it quiet. He said he loved you, that he couldn't lose you. He promised to support us, to be part of Amara's life, even if he couldn't acknowledge her publicly." Marion's heart shattered into pieces with each word. The betrayal cut through her like a knife, each revelation deeper than the last. She looked at Amara, who had tears in her eyes but didn't fully understand the gravity of what was happening. "And the necklace?" Marion asked, her voice choked with emotion. "That was my gift to him. Why does she have it?" Lydia looked down at Amara, gently touching the locket around her neck. "Charles gave it to her on her 5th birthday. He said it was special, that he wanted her to have something from him that showed how much he cared." Marion felt her world crumble around her. Everything she thought she knew about her marriage, about Charles, it was all built on lies and secrets. The life they had built together suddenly felt like a house of cards. Collapsing under the weight of this revelation, she stood up abruptly, unable to stay any longer. The pain was too much. The reality of Charles's double life too overwhelming. Without another word, she turned and walked out of the apartment, tears streaming down her face. Claire quickly thanked Lydia and followed Marion out. She found her friend leaning against the wall in the hallway, her body shaking with silent sobs. "Take me home, Claire," Marion whispered. "Please, just take me home." As they drove back in silence, Marion stared out the window, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. The man she had loved, the life she thought she had. it was all tainted now. And yet she couldn't shake the image of Amara's innocent face, or the obvious love between the child and her mother. Marion knew that nothing would ever be the same, but as the familiar streets of her neighborhood came into view, she also knew that this wasn't the end. Somehow she would have to find a way to move forward, to make sense of this new reality. What that meant and how she would do it, she had no idea. But as Claire pulled up to her house, Marion felt a tiny spark of determination ignite within her. She would find a way through this, no matter how difficult the path might be. In the days following the confrontation with Lydia, Marion felt as if she were moving through a fog. The revelations about Charles's secret life had shaken her to her core, leaving her feeling adrift in a sea of uncertainty. She went through the motions of daily life, eating, sleeping, going to work, but it all felt hollow, meaningless. One evening, about a week after meeting Lydia, Marion found herself unable to bear the silence of her empty house any longer. Without really thinking about it, she grabbed her car keys and headed out. She drove aimlessly at first, but soon realized she was taking the familiar route to the cemetery. As she parked her car and stepped out into the cool evening air, Marion felt a strange mix of emotions churning inside her. Anger, grief, confusion, and a desperate need for something. Closure? Understanding? She wasn't sure. Marion made her way to Charles's grave, her steps slow and hesitant. When she reached the headstone, she stood there for a long moment, staring at the name etched in stone. Then, almost without realizing it, she began to speak. "Why did you lie to me, Charles?" she whispered, her voice gaining strength as she continued. "Why did you pretend to love me while hiding something like this? Was I not enough for you?" She knelt down, pressing her hand against the cold stone, her tears falling freely now. "I gave you everything, Charles. My love, my trust, my whole life. And all along, you had this secret family. How could you do this to me? To us?" The anger and sorrow mixed until they became one, a heavy weight in her chest that she didn't know how to carry. "I thought we were happy. I thought we had a future together. But it was all a lie, wasn't it? Every moment, every promise. It was all tainted by your secrets." Marion's voice broke as she continued. "And Amara? God, Charles, how could you do that to her? To your own daughter? Living in that tiny apartment while we had so much. Did you ever really love her? Did you ever really love me?" She sat there for what felt like hours, pouring out all her pain and confusion to the silent headstone. As her tears began to subside, Marion heard footsteps approaching. She looked up to see Claire walking towards her, concern etched on her face. "Oh, Marion," Claire said softly, kneeling down beside her friend. "I've been looking everywhere for you. Are you okay?" Marion shook her head, fresh tears springing to her eyes. "I don't know, Claire. I don't know if I'll ever be okay again. How do I move past this? How do I make sense of any of it?" Claire wrapped an arm around Marion's shoulders, pulling her close. "I wish I had an easy answer for you, but I do know this. You're strong, Marion, stronger than you realize. You'll find a way through this, and I'll be here to help you every step of the way." Marion leaned into her friend's embrace, feeling grateful for Claire's unwavering support. They sat there together in silence for a while, the peacefulness of the cemetery a stark contrast to the turmoil in Marion's heart. Finally, Marion spoke again, her voice quiet but steadier. "I don't think I can forgive him, Claire. Not for the affair, not for lying to me all those years. But Amara, she's innocent in all of this. And seeing where they live, how they've struggled, I can't help but feel responsible somehow." Claire nodded, understanding in her eyes. "You have every right to be angry, Marion. What Charles did was inexcusable. But you're right about Amara. She's just a child caught in the middle of all this. Whatever you decide to do, I know you'll do what's best for everyone involved." Marion stood up slowly, her legs stiff from kneeling for so long. She looked down at Charles's grave one last time, a mix of emotions playing across her face. "I don't know what happens next," she said softly, "but I know I can't keep living in the past. I need to find a way to move forward, for my own sake if nothing else." Claire stood up beside her, giving Marion's hand a gentle squeeze. "That's the first step, Marion. And you don't have to figure it all out tonight. Let's get you home, and we can talk more tomorrow if you'd like." As they walked back to their cars, Marion felt a subtle shift within herself. The pain was still there, the betrayal still raw, but there was also a glimmer of something else, a determination to not let Charles's actions define the rest of her life. She didn't know what the future held or how she would navigate this new complicated reality. But as she drove home, following Claire's car, Marion knew one thing for certain. She would find a way through this. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight, but she would find a way to rebuild her life on her own terms. The graveyard confrontation hadn't given her the closure she'd hoped for, but it had given her something perhaps more valuable, the strength to start looking forward instead of back. And for now, that was enough to keep her going. 8 months passed, and Marion did her best to rebuild her life. She threw herself into her work, finding solace in the familiar routines and challenges of her job. She started seeing a therapist, working through her grief and anger in weekly sessions that left her emotionally drained but gradually more at peace. She focused on small routines that gave her a sense of control: morning jogs in the park, weekend cooking classes, volunteering at the local animal shelter. Slowly, painfully, she began to rediscover who she was outside of her marriage to Charles. But despite her best efforts, the weight of the past lingered. She avoided thoughts of Charles as much as possible and tried not to dwell on Lydia and Amara. Yet in quiet moments, when her guard was down, memories and questions would flood back, leaving her feeling unsettled and uncertain. One sunny Saturday afternoon, as Marion was returning from a volunteer shift at the shelter, she saw a familiar figure standing on her front porch. Her heart rate quickened as she recognized Lydia, looking even more frail and gaunt than the last time they'd met. Marion approached slowly, a mix of emotions churning inside her. "Lydia," she called out softly, "what are you doing here?" Lydia turned, and Marion was struck by how ill she looked. Dark circles framed her sunken eyes, and her body seemed to have shrunk, as if she were collapsing in on herself. "I'm sorry to show up unannounced," Lydia said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I needed to talk to you. It's important." Marion hesitated for a moment, then nodded. She unlocked the door and led Lydia inside, gesturing for her to sit on the couch. An uncomfortable silence settled between them as Marion took a seat across from her late husband's mistress. Finally, Lydia began to speak, her words halting and filled with emotion. "I know I have no right to ask anything of you, Marion. What Charles and I did, it was wrong. We hurt you deeply, and I'm so sorry for that." Marion felt her throat tighten, but she remained silent, letting Lydia continue. "The thing is," Lydia went on, her voice breaking, "I'm dying. I have ovarian cancer, and it's terminal. The doctors say I don't have much time left." Marion's eyes widened in shock. Whatever she had expected Lydia to say, it wasn't this. I'm so sorry," she managed to say, the words feeling inadequate in the face of such news. Lydia nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Thank you, but that's not why I'm here. I'm here because of Amara." At the mention of the little girl's name, Marion felt her heart clench. "What about her?" she asked cautiously. Lydia took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I have no family left. No one who can take care of Amara when I'm gone. The thought of her ending up in the system, in some orphanage or foster home, it terrifies me." Marion began to understand where this was going, and she felt a surge of panic rising within her. Surely Lydia couldn't be asking what she thought she was asking. "Believe me," Lydia continued, her voice pleading, "this has to be the hardest decision I've ever had to make. I know neither of us deserves your forgiveness, but Amara is innocent in all of this. I don't want her to end up alone when I'm gone. She deserves a family, someone who can love her and provide for her." She paused, her eyes meeting Marion's. "I believe that could be you if you're willing." The request hit Marion like a physical blow. She stood up abruptly, pacing the room as she tried to process what Lydia was asking of her. How could she take on the responsibility of the child who symbolized all of Charles's betrayal? "Lydia," Marion said, her voice strained, I don't know what to say. It's too much. How can you expect me to raise the child my husband had with another woman?" Lydia's shoulders slumped, but there was a desperate determination in her eyes. I know it's an impossible thing to ask, but Amara is Charles's daughter too. She's smart and kind, and she deserves a chance at a good life. I thought, I hope that maybe you could see past what Charles and I did and see her for who she is, an innocent child who needs love and stability. Marian felt tears pricking at her eyes. She thought of Amara, of the fear in the little girl's eyes when they had confronted Lydia months ago. She thought of the tiny apartment they lived in, of the struggles they must have faced. Despite everything, she couldn't deny that her heart ached for the child. I I need time to think about this, Marian said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. It's not a decision I can make lightly. Lydia nodded, understanding in her eyes. Of course. I know it's a lot to ask, but please, Marian, consider it. Amara is all I have, and knowing she'll be taken care of, it would mean everything to me. As Lydia stood to leave, Marian noticed how much effort it took her, how each movement seemed to cause her pain. The reality of Lydia's illness hit her anew, and she felt a wave of compassion, despite everything that had happened. I'll think about it, Marian said as she walked Lydia to the door. I promise. After Lydia left, Marian sank onto the couch, her mind reeling. She sat there for hours, lost in thought, weighing the enormity of what Lydia had asked of her. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the living room, Marian reached for her phone. She needed to talk to someone, needed help making sense of this impossible situation. The next day, Marian sat in her kitchen, a cup of untouched coffee growing cold in front of her. Across the table, Claire listened intently as Marian recounted her conversation with Lydia. I can't believe she would ask you that after everything, Claire said, her voice tight with anger. Charles lied to you, betrayed you, and she helped him. And now she wants you to pick up the pieces? Marian nodded, tears rolling down her cheeks. I know. Part of me wants to tell her no, to shut the door on this whole painful chapter of my life. But then I think about Amara. Her voice trailed off, choked with emotion. Claire's expression softened. She reached across the table, taking Marian's hand in hers. What are you thinking, Mar? Marian took a shaky breath. I don't know what to do, Claire. I hate what they did to me. But Amara, she's just a child. She didn't ask for any of this. The thought of her alone, in the system, it breaks my heart. Claire squeezed Marian's hand gently. You're right, Amara is innocent in all this. But this is your choice, Marian. You need to do what feels right for you, not out of guilt or obligation. Whatever you decide, I'll be here to support you. Marian nodded, grateful for her friend's unwavering support. I keep thinking about how different my life would be if I say yes. I'd be a mother overnight, to a child I barely know. A child who reminds me of the worst betrayal of my life. But then, she continued, her voice softening, I remember how scared she looked that day at Lydia's apartment, how tightly she held on to that locket, the only real connection she had to her father. And I wonder, could I grow to love her? Could I be the mother she needs? Claire listened patiently, her face a mix of concern and compassion. Those are all valid thoughts and feelings, Marian. It's an incredibly complex situation. Have you considered talking to a therapist about this? It might help to get a professional perspective. Marian nodded. I have an appointment next week. I'm hoping it will help me sort through all of this. As the days passed, Marian found herself oscillating between different decisions. One moment, she was certain she couldn't take on the responsibility of raising Amara. The next, she was looking up information on adoption and single parenting. She spoke with her therapist, who helped her work through her conflicting emotions. They talked about forgiveness, not for Charles or Lydia, but for Marian herself, about letting go of the anger and hurt, not to excuse what had happened, but to free herself from its grip. 2 weeks after Lydia's visit, Marian found herself standing in front of the mirror in her bedroom. She looked at her reflection, searching for answers in her own eyes. Can I do this? She asked her reflection. Can I open my heart to Amara, knowing where she came from? Can I be the mother she needs? As she stood there, Marian thought about her own childhood, about the love and security her parents had given her. She thought about the future she had imagined with Charles, the children they had planned to have, and she thought about Amara, a little girl who had done nothing wrong, who deserved love and stability as much as any child. In that moment, looking at herself in the mirror, Marion made her decision. It wouldn't be easy, she knew. There would be challenges and hard days ahead, but in her heart, she knew it was the right thing to do. With trembling hands, she reached for her phone and dialed Lydia's number. The next day, Marion drove to Lydia's apartment, her heart racing with a mix of anticipation and fear. She had called Lydia the night before, telling her that she wanted to talk about Amara. Lydia had sounded weak over the phone, but relieved that Marion was willing to discuss the situation further. As Marion parked her car outside the rundown apartment building, she took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. She had asked Claire to come with her for support, and her friend gave her an encouraging smile as they got out of the car. They climbed the stairs to Lydia's apartment, the building quiet except for the distant sound of a television and a baby crying. Marion knocked on the door, but there was no answer. She knocked again, louder this time, but still nothing. A feeling of unease settled over Marion. She tried the doorknob and found it unlocked. Exchanging a worried glance with Claire, she pushed the door open. "Lydia?" Marion called out as they entered the small apartment. "It's Marion. Are you here?" The living room was empty, but as they moved further into the apartment, they heard a soft sound coming from the bedroom. Marion's heart sank as she recognized the sound of a child crying. She rushed to the bedroom, Claire close behind her. What she saw made her gasp in shock and sorrow. Lydia lay motionless on the bed, her skin pale and waxy. Beside her, curled up against her mother's side, was Amara. The little girl was sobbing, shaking Lydia's arm and begging her to wake up. "Mommy, please wake up," Amara cried, her voice filled with desperation and fear. "Please, Mommy, don't leave me." Marion felt her heart breaking at the sight. Without thinking, she moved forward, gently pulling Amara into her arms. The child resisted at first, clinging to her mother, but then collapsed against Marion, her small body racked with sobs. "Shh, it's okay," Marion soothed, stroking Amara's hair. "I'm here. You're not alone." Claire, her own eyes filled with tears, quickly called for an ambulance. But Marion knew, looking at Lydia's still form, that it was too late. Lydia was gone, leaving Amara truly alone in the world. As they waited for the ambulance and police to arrive, Marion held Amara close, murmuring words of comfort. The little girl cried herself into exhaustion, finally falling into a fitful sleep in Marion's arms. Looking down at the child's tear-stained face, Marion felt a surge of protectiveness. In that moment, all her doubts and fears seemed to fade away. She knew, with absolute certainty, that she would do whatever it took to care for this little girl, to give her the love and security she deserved. The next few hours were a blur of paramedics, police officers, and social workers. Marion answered questions, filled out forms, and made phone calls. Through it all, she kept Amara close, shielding the child as much as she could from the chaos around them. When a social worker approached, talking about temporary foster care for Amara, Marion felt a flash of panic. "No," she said firmly, "Amara will be coming home with me. Her mother asked me to take care of her. I intend to honor that request." The social worker looked skeptical. "Ms. Thompson, I understand you want to help, but there are procedures we need to follow. We can't just release a child to someone who isn't a relative." Marion stood her ground. "I was married to Amara's father. I may not be her biological mother, but I'm the closest thing to family she has right now. Please let me take her home. You can do whatever checks you need to, but don't put her through the trauma of foster care on top of losing her mother." After much discussion and several phone calls, the social worker reluctantly agreed to let Amara go home with Marion on the condition that she begin the formal process of becoming Amara's guardian as soon as possible. As they finally left the apartment, Amara still sleeping in Marion's arms, Claire touched her friend's shoulder gently. "Are you sure about this, Marion?" she asked softly. "It's a big responsibility." Marion looked down at Amara's sleeping face, then back at her friend. "I'm sure," she said, her voice steady and determined. "It won't be easy, but it's the right thing to do. Amara needs me, and I think I need her too." As they walked to the car, Marion felt a mix of emotions: grief for Lydia, sorrow for Amara's loss, and a deep sense of responsibility. But underneath it all was a feeling she hadn't expected: Hope. Hope for a new beginning, for a chance to create a family in a way she never could have imagined. The road ahead would be challenging, she knew. But looking at the child in her arms, Marion felt ready to face whatever came next. Together, she and Amara would find a way forward, healing old wounds and building a new life, one day at a time. The weeks that followed Lydia's death were a whirlwind of activity and emotion for Marion. Taking Amara in was overwhelming, to say the least. There were endless meetings with social services, paperwork to fill out, and the daunting task of creating a stable home for a grieving 7-year-old. Marion threw herself into the process, determined to do right by Amara. She converted her home office into a bedroom, letting Amara choose the colors and decorations. She enrolled the girl in a nearby school, arranged for grief counseling, and did her best to create routines that would help Amara feel safe and secure. There were challenging moments, of course. Nights when Amara would wake up crying for her mother, days when the little girl would retreat into herself, refusing to speak or eat. Marion weathered these storms with patience and love, reminding herself that healing takes time. Despite the circumstances that brought them together, Marion found herself slowly warming to Amara. The little girl was smart and kind, with a resilience that amazed Marion. She saw glimpses of Charles in Amara's smile, in the way she furrowed her brow when concentrating. But instead of bringing pain, these similarities now brought a bittersweet kind of comfort. One evening, about a month after Amara had come to live with her, Marianne sat on the couch, watching Amara work on a puzzle on the living room floor. The little girl was wearing the locket. She rarely took it off, and as she leaned forward, it swung free from her shirt. Marianne felt a twinge in her heart at the sight, but it wasn't the sharp pain she had expected. Instead, she felt a complex mix of emotions: sadness for the past, hope for the future, and a growing love for the child in front of her. "Amara," Marion said softly, "can you come here for a moment?" The little girl looked up, a question in her eyes, but she obediently came and sat next to Marion on the couch. Marion gently touched the locket around Amara's neck. "Do you know why your daddy gave you this?" Amara nodded solemnly. "Mommy said it was because he loved me, even though he couldn't be with us all the time." Marion felt tears prick at her eyes, but she smiled through them. "That's right. Your daddy did love you very much. And you know what? I think he'd be very proud of how brave you've been." Amara's lower lip trembled. "Do you think Mommy would be proud too?" "Oh, sweetheart," Marion said, pulling Amara into a hug. "Your mommy would be so, so proud of you. She loved you more than anything in the world." As Amara snuggled into her embrace, Marion felt something shift inside her. She realized that she no longer saw this child as a symbol of Charles's betrayal. Amara was simply Amara, a little girl who needed love, who had wormed her way into Marion's heart despite everything. The day of Lydia's funeral was quiet and somber. Marion stood with Amara beside Lydia's grave, Claire next to them for support. The service was small, attended by a handful of people, mostly neighbors and a few of Lydia's co-workers. Marion felt a complex mix of emotions as she listened to the pastor speak about Lydia's life. There was still anger there. Anger at Lydia for her part in the lies, anger at Charles for everything he had done. But there was also pity for Lydia's fate, and an overwhelming sense of responsibility for the little girl whose hand she held. As the funeral concluded, Marion took a moment to reflect. The betrayal by Charles and Lydia still lingered, the pain of it ever present. She knew she might never fully heal from what they had done to her. But when she looked down at Amara, she no longer saw the product of her husband's betrayal. She saw a child who had lost everything and who now looked to her for love and security. Marion knelt down, bringing herself to eye level with Amara. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" she asked gently. Amara nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. "I miss Mommy," she whispered. "I know you do," Marion said, pulling the girl into a hug. "And it's okay to miss her. We'll always remember her, okay? But I want you to know that you're not alone. I'm here for you, always." As they left the graveyard, Amara's small hand clasped tightly in hers, Marion felt a sense of purpose wash over her. This wasn't the life she had planned, nor the family she had imagined. But it was real, and it was hers. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be challenges, setbacks, and days when the weight of the past felt too heavy to bear. But looking at Amara, Marion felt a determination she hadn't known she possessed. This was not a happy ending, nor one filled with easy forgiveness, but it was a beginning, a chance to create something meaningful out of the ashes of betrayal and loss. As they walked to the car, Marion made a silent promise to herself and to Amara. They would face whatever came next together, building a new life one day at a time.